The first time she saw him, he was leaning against the hitch rail outside Carson's feed supply, head bent low under the shadow of his hat brim, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his dust-caked duster. It had been 6 months since she'd buried Matthew, and 5 months since the doctor quietly told her, without lifting his eyes from his ledger, that she was carrying a delicate life in uncertain times. Now she stood in the middle of the boardwalk, holding the brim of her bonnet as the late summer wind carried dust across Main Street. It was the same dust that had been hanging in the air for weeks, a dry metallic taste that no water could wash away. Folks said the drought was worse than any in 30 years. The railroad men said it was worse for some than for others, which was their way of letting people know they'd be buying water rights cheap. It wasn't just the dust that made her heart quicken when she saw him. It was the blood memory of a November afternoon, the sound of a shot echoing in the gulch above their pasture, the sight of Matthew crumpling into the frost, and a figure, that figure, riding hard in the other direction. She almost turned away then, almost walked into Carson's store for lamp oil and flour and the little paper twist of licorice candy she'd been saving for her classroom. But she'd been waiting 6 months for this, waiting through mornings when she could barely lift herself from bed, through afternoons when the sun's weight felt heavy enough to crush the roof of her small house, through nights when the baby's faint stirring reminded her there were 2 hearts depending on her now. She crossed the street without looking for wagons. The plank sidewalk creaked under her boots. She stopped 2 paces from him. He didn't look up. "You're a long way from the high country," she said. The wind caught the hem of her dress, lifting its legs, partly to show the tops of her scuffed boots. His jaw moved, slow as a man chewing over a thought he didn't much like. "Depends who's asking. I'm the widow of the man you killed." A few men unloading sacks of grain from the store's freight wagon froze mid-lift. Carson himself, a big-bellied man with more beard than chin, glanced up from behind his counter inside. The drifter's head came up then, and she saw the same eyes she'd seen that day on the ridge, pale and hard, like winter sky before snow. "I don't recall. You do." Her voice was flat, steady. "You had his blood on your hands before it hit the ground." "I remember." The pause between them was as dry as the dust in the air. Finally, he said, "You looking for justice?" She shook her head. "No. I'm looking for protection." That made him shift his weight. His hand drifted near the open front of his coat, where a revolver grip poked from a worn leather holster. She went on before he could speak. "The railroad men have been riding the valley. They're offering paper deeds for water rights, and when folks won't sign, their wells go bad, or their cattle turn up lame. They came to me last week. I told them no. Yesterday, I found a dead crow nailed to my barn door." The drifter's eyes narrowed slightly. "I have a child coming," she said, "and a piece of land worth taking. I can't fight both." "You're asking the wrong man." "No," she said. "I'm asking the only one who knows what it costs to take a life and still keep breathing." He stared at her for a long time, the way a man might stare at a card in his hand, Chapanian, when he already knows it's the losing one. Then he said, "Why me? Because if the railroad sends men, they'll send the kind who don't scare easy. The kind who can't be talked out of a fight. The kind like you. I don't work for charity. I don't expect you to. I'll pay." "With what?" "Land," she said simply. 10 acres along the creek, enough to keep you in beans and bullets for a good long while. He studied her, and in that moment she saw the faintest shadow of something behind his eye. Not guilt, not pity, but recognition. "You know I could take that land without lifting a finger," he said. "I know you could," she replied, "but I'm giving you the chance to earn it." The freight men had gone back to unloading grain, but slower now, listening. Carson stepped onto the boardwalk, wiping his hands on his apron. "You need a witness for this bargain, Mrs. Cade?" he asked, a little too loudly. She didn't take her eyes off the drifter. Not yet. Finally, he reached into his coat, slow, deliberate, and pulled out a battered cigarette tin. He tapped one out, struck a match on the railing, and let the smoke curl upward between them. "I'll think on it," he said. "You've got until sundown," she replied. "After that, I'll find someone else." She turned and walked away without looking back, the wind tugging at her skirts, her heart hammering not from fear, but from something colder, the knowledge that she had just placed her life in the hands of the man who had taken Matthews. And somewhere, beneath the dry rustle of wind and the hollow thud of her boots on the walk, she thought she could already hear the first creak of the wheels of war rolling into her valley. That evening, as the sun bled orange over the mountains, she stood on her porch watching the road into town. She'd lit the lamp early, its glow spilling onto the hard-packed yard. A signal she told herself was just for her own comfort. But she knew better. She didn't see him at first, just the slow approach of a horse's shadow along the fence line. Then the hat, the duster, the figure she had sworn she would never speak to. He stopped at the edge of her yard. "You got yourself a deal," he said. The night air smelled of dust and far-off rain that would never reach them. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote barked once and fell silent. She stepped down from the porch. "Then we'd better talk out what's coming." He glanced toward the barn, then back to her. "We'd better talk about who's coming." The rain never came that night. By morning, the dry wind had stripped the sky bare, a dull yellow light spilling across the land like a wound. Sarah woke before the rooster, sitting upright on the narrow bed, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. She hadn't slept much, but that was no surprise. Sleep had been a luxury since Thomas died. The stranger, her stranger now, she supposed, was in the barn. She'd left him there with a blanket, a pitcher of water, and the warning that she kept a shotgun under her bed. Whether he believed her or not, he hadn't tested her. From the window she could see him now, leaning against the open barn door, a strip of rawhide between his teeth. He didn't look like a man trying to earn trust. He looked like a man who was counting the hours until he could leave. She boiled water for coffee, the rich smell filling the small kitchen, and tried to imagine her neighbors' faces when they saw him. Sarah knew how fast talk moved in a place like this. If word hadn't reached town yet that she'd taken in a drifter, that drifter, it soon would. And when it did, they'd call her a fool. At the table, she wrote a list. Things that needed doing before the week was out. Mend the south fence. Draw up a new water allotment agreement with Mr. Carter. Ride into town for supplies. And, scrawled at the bottom, decide about him. By the time the sun was high, she stepped out with a tin mug in each hand. He looked up as she approached, his eyes narrowed against the glare. "Coffee," she said, holding one out. He took it, careful not to brush her fingers. "Much obliged." For a moment, they stood there, the silence thick enough to taste. "I got work needs doing," she said finally. "If you're staying, you're working." His mouth pulled into the ghost of a smile. "And if I'm not staying?" She didn't blink. Then I guess you'll still be working. Call it payment. Ensom ent for the bed and the coffee. He chuckled once, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a hard woman, Mrs. Talbot. She didn't bother correcting him to Mrs. No longer. They spent the day in the pasture, mending the fence line. He worked with a kind of quiet efficiency, his hands sure, his shoulders steady. Sarah noticed things, how he never wasted a movement, how he glanced toward the horizon more than most, how he kept a revolver on his hip, even when both hands were busy with wire and posts. By mid-afternoon, she risked a question. Where were you headed? He looked at her for a long moment, then shrugged. Nowhere in particular, just away. Away from what? He drove a post into the ground, hard enough that the wood split at the top. Does it matter? Yes. Her voice was sharper than she meant it to be. He set the hammer down, met her eyes. From people like you. People who want to know more than they ought. They worked in silence until the sun began to dip. As they walked back toward the house, she could feel the weight of his presence behind her. Not threatening exactly, more like a shadow she hadn't invited but couldn't shake. On the porch, she paused. Why'd you kill him? He stopped at the bottom step. That's the first time you've asked me plain. I'm asking now. The wind stirred, lifting a strand of her hair. He looked tired, older than he had that morning. Your husband drew first, he said finally. That's the truth of it. We were both standing in the dust, both with our hands near iron. But he made the choice, and I made mine. She gripped the rail until her knuckles whitened. And that makes it right. No, but it makes it what it was. Inside, she ladled out stew from the pot, the smell of carrots and venison filling the small room. He ate with slow, deliberate motions, as though he'd been taught not to waste a thing. When they were, Idon! She cleared the bowls and said, You'll come into town with me tomorrow. His brow lifted. That wise? No, she admitted. But I need someone at my side. And you're here. He leaned back, studying her. You're not afraid of me. I am, she said. But fear's not the worst thing a person can feel. And what is? The following morning broke under a sky the color of dry bone. The wind carried with it the smell of dust from far-off cattle trails, the kind of air that scraped your throat just for breathing it. From her porch, Clara watched the horizon, her coffee cooling untouched in her hand. She'd been up long before the sun, mind restless from what she'd agreed to the night before. The drifter, Elias Kane, she now knew his name, was out there somewhere, walking the perimeter of her land like a man counting sins. She wasn't sure if he was measuring the distance to protect her or to escape. By mid-morning, Kane came back into view, hat low, shirt damp with sweat from the work he'd taken upon himself. He set down a coil of barbed wire, its edges shining like broken glass in the sun. You don't have to fix my fences, Clara called out. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand and looked up at her, squinting. They were cut. Someone's been testing your line. Could be cattle thieves, could be the syndicate. His voice carried no judgment, but the words weighed heavy. Or could just be neighbors tired of me owning what they think they deserve, she said, stepping down from the porch. Happens when a woman tries to hold on to land out here. Kane's jaw flexed, like he was chewing on something he'd rather not say. Out here, holding on to anything gets you killed. Especially land. Later that day, word reached her through Martha Jenkins, the town seamstress and unofficial gossip wheel, that talk was spreading. Heard you've got a man staying on your property, Martha said, with a little too much sparkle in her eye. Clara didn't rise to the bait. "And?" she asked, folding laundry with steady hands. "Well, folks are wondering. This man ain't fraud. Around here, no family, no history anyone can find. Some say he's one of the syndicate's hired guns. Others," she let the word dangle, letting Clara fill in the rest. Clara thought about telling her the truth, that he was a hired gun once, and that his hands had ended the life of the man she loved. But the truth didn't buy her anything in this town except more whispers. "I'll take my chances," Clara said finally, meeting Martha's gaze until the woman looked away. That evening, Clara found Kane sitting by the old well, rolling a cigarette between his fingers but never lighting it. "You don't strike me as the type who stays anywhere long," she said, leaning against the well's worn stones. "I'm not," he replied. "But I owe you something. Least I can do is see you through this trouble." She met his eyes. Helpless. That night, long after she'd banked the fire, she lay awake, listening to the barn creak in the wind. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote called. She thought of her husband's grave, of the child turning slow circles inside her, of the man in the barn with blood on his hands, and she wondered which of them would break first, him, the land, or her. "You owe me." Her voice carried both curiosity and suspicion. He met her eyes, and for the first time there was no mask in his expression. "I didn't know he had a wife, didn't know he had a child on the way, but knowing now, I can't just walk." The wind picked up, carrying dust between them like a thin curtain. Clara searched his face for lies, but all she found was a man caught between the shadow of what he'd done and the faint outline of something that might be redemption. The sound of hooves broke the moment. A rider approached from the south, kicking up a storm of grit behind him. By the time he reached the yard, Clara recognized the brand on his horse's flank, the railroad syndicate. The rider tipped his hat, but didn't smile. "Miss Hollis," he said, voice too smooth for the dust-choked air, "the company extends one last offer before legal action is taken." Kane stepped forward, shoulders squared. "She's not selling." The rider's eyes flicked between them, and a slow grin formed. "Didn't realize you had help. Be careful who you trust, ma'am. Some debts don't wash clean, no matter how many fences a man mends." With that, he turned and rode off, leaving the air thick with threat. That night, Clara lay awake, one hand resting on the curve of her stomach, feeling the faintest flutter beneath. In the next room, Kane paced the floor, a shadow moving back and forth. She realized something then. This fight wasn't just hers anymore. And whether she liked it or not, the man who killed her husband was now the one man standing between her and the dust. It was past midnight when Clara woke to the smell. Not the sweet, faint scent of a lamp left burning. No, this was sharper, dirtier. Smoke. She pushed herself upright, heartbeat climbing. Through the window, the night was streaked with orange at the far end of her pasture. "Kane," she called, but he was already at her door, shirt half-buttoned, rifle in hand. "They lit your south fence," he said. "If the wind shifts, the barn goes next." The two of them ran, boots chewing up the hard ground, the air growing hotter with each step. Clara's skirts caught on a mesquite branch, ripping, but she didn't slow. By the time they reached the fire, the grass was already a black, hissing carpet. Someone had poured oil along the fence posts. Each one burned like a torch, crackling in the darkness. Kane didn't waste time swearing. He shoved the rifle into her hands. If you see anyone, don't think, just shoot." Then he sprinted into the smoke with a burlap sack and a bucket, beating at the flames, cursing under his breath. From her position near the fence line, Clara scanned the shadows. At first, all she heard was the fire, the pop of wood, the hiss of grass turning to ash. Then near far, but clear, came the sound of a horse shifting in the dark. She raised the rifle, sighting just beyond the wavering edge of light. A figure moved, tall, hat low, coat whipping in the wind. Whoever it was didn't seem to care about hiding. They just stood there, watching the fire spread. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger, but something in the stillness stopped her. Instead of shooting, she called out, "You think this scares me?" The figure's head tilted, and then, as if her defiance amused them, they swung into the saddle and disappeared into the night. By the time the fire was out, Clara's lungs burned from the smoke, and Kane's hands were black with soot. They leaned against the charred fence, catching their breath. "They wanted you to see it," Kane said finally. "Wanted to show they can touch this land whenever they feel like it." Clara wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, tasting ash. "Then they just learned something too," she said, her voice low. "I'm not leaving." The next day, the news of the fire reached town. Some folks stopped her in the street to offer help. Others just stared, eyes sliding toward Kane like they were already writing her name in the wrong kind of ledger. Sheriff Dobbs found her outside the post office. "Miss Hollis," he said, "you've got to understand. The railroad's got papers, lawyers, money. You've got grit, sure, but grit burns up faster than you think." She looked at him over the letters in her hand. "And what happens to the law when it stops standing between the people and the fire?" The sheriff's face tightened, and he walked away without answering. That night, Kane sat at her kitchen table, rolling another cigarette he didn't light. "They'll be back," he said. "Next time, they won't just burn your fence." Clara set a mug of coffee in front of him. "Then I guess we'd better be ready." Outside, the wind carried the scent of scorched wood across the fields, a reminder that their war had begun, whether either of them wanted it or not. The first sign was the dust cloud on the horizon. Not the gentle lift of a single rider or a wagon, but the heavy, rolling smear of a dozen horses moving hard. Clara was stringing new wire where the south fence had burned when Kane came up beside her, jaw tight. "They're not bothering with subtle anymore," he said. She shaded her eyes and counted silhouettes. 12, maybe 13? 14, Kane corrected. "And they're riding like they own the place." By the time the riders reached the main gate, the sun was high enough to burn away any last scrap of morning cool. Their leader, a broad man with a coat too fine for the dust, swung down from his horse. The others stayed mounted, hands never straying far from their belts. "Miss Hollis," the man said, tipping his hat in a gesture that wasn't polite so much as mocking. "I'm Lester Crane. I represent the Southern Pacific Railway Company." "You represent their thugs," Kane said before she could answer. Crane's eyes flicked to him, and the smile didn't falter, but it cooled. "Your drifter friend's right about one thing," he said. "I'm here to end this unpleasantness before it escalates." Clara leaned against the fence post, hands steady. "This is my land. My husband's before me. It's not for sale." Crane chuckled like she'd told a sweet joke. "Everything's for sale, Mrs. Hollis. The question is whether you want to sell now, with money in your hand, or later, when the price is fire and ruin." One of the mounted men spat in the dirt. Another let his hand rest heavy on the butt of his pistol. Kane stepped forward just enough to make it clear he'd draw faster. "You might want to pick your words more careful," he said. Crane studied him for a moment, then looked back to Clara. "Think on it. You've got 1 week. After that," he tipped his hat again, "trains don't stop for fence posts." They rode away without Lo, oaking back, the dust they left behind settling on her boots like fine powder. Kane turned to her. "They're giving you a week because they think you'll break." "They're wrong," she said. That night, she couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounded like a match being struck. She lit a lamp and sat at the table, going over the ledger, feed costs, water barrels, repair wood, as if numbers might keep her grounded. Kane came in from the porch, rifle slung. "I've been thinking," he said. "You've got neighbors. Some like you, some don't. But they've all got something the railroad wants. If we make this just your fight, you'll stand alone. If we make it everyone's fight, they'll have to burn the whole county to win," she finished. They shared a look. Not hope, not yet, but the faint edge of a plan. By the time Clara hitched the wagon and rolled into town, the sun had barely cleared the rooftops, but already the air shimmered with heat. The dust on Main Street clung to the hem of her dress as she stepped down, squaring her shoulders. If she'd learned anything from teaching school, it was that you had to stand tall even when your knees shook. The Mercantile was the first stop. Henry Thatch, owner and keeper of the town's ledger for 30 years, leaned on the counter when she walked in. "Mrs. Hollis," he said, voice slow. "Heard you had visitors." "Word travels fast," she replied. Henry scratched his jaw. "Railroad boys come through here last week. Said they're bringing jobs, progress, and a station. Folks like the sound of it." "Until they find out the station's built on someone else's grave," she said. Henry's eyes flickered. Sympathy, maybe, but it was gone before it could settle. Some folks figure graves are part of progress. Outside, she found Kane tying off the horses. "Well?" he asked. "Henry's not wet. With us? Might not be against us either, but he's leaning the wrong way." Kane grunted. "We'll need better than fence-sitters." They went next to the livery, where old Etta Mason was brushing down. A gray mare. Etta had been born in this valley before the tracks even reached the next state over, and she had no patience for strangers telling her how things ought to be. When Clara explained the railroad's threat, Etta's mouth went thin as a fence wire. "They think they can take my grazing land?" Etta spat. "Let 'em try. I'll put a bullet between the eyes of the first man who sets foot past my gate." One ally, Clara thought. Not enough. The saloon was louder than usual for mid-morning. Men stood in clusters, voices low but urgent. At the bar, Sheriff Dunley was nursing a coffee that smelled more like whiskey. "Sheriff," Clara said, approaching. He turned, and the look in his eyes made her stomach dip. "Mrs. Hollis, heard you had a bit of trouble out your way." "Trouble's still riding toward me," she said. "I need to know where you stand." The sheriff's gaze slid toward a table in the corner, where 3 men she didn't know sat with their hats pulled low. "They've got money, Clara. More than this town's ever seen. If I start a fight with them, I might as well pin a target to my chest." "So you'll stand by while they burn me out?" "I'll stand by," he said, "and hope it don't come to that." Outside, Kane's jaw was tight. "He's theirs." "Not just him," Clara said. She looked up and down the street, suddenly seeing the town different. Not as home, but as a place already half bought and paid for. By the time they headed back, they had 2 allies, Etta Mason and a wiry rancher named Cal Porter, against a tide of indifference and quiet betrayal. But that night, As Clara sat by the fire, she felt something shift. The fear was still there, but it had company now. Something heavier, something that might yet grow into resolve. The week they'd promised her didn't even last 3 days. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, not the rich, sweet smell of a cooking fire, but the sharp, dry stink of burning wood and scorched earth. The baby kicked as if it knew something was wrong. She pushed the blanket off, grabbed her boots, and stumbled to the door. Cain was already outside, bareheaded, scanning the dark horizon. His silhouette was outlined in a dull orange glow. "North fence," he said. They lit it. Clara's first thought wasn't of the fence or the pasture. It was of the wind. It had been steady all night, blowing south toward the barn. The barn held not only her horses, but the last of the hay from the good years. "We have to cut it off," she said. Cain was already hauling buckets from the well, but they both knew water wouldn't be enough. The fire had been set clever, 3 places at once, so it would crawl inward like a noose. By the time they reached the north fence, the flames were already head-high, snapping and spitting sparks into the dark. The wood posts crackled like bones in a fire pit. Cain handed her a shovel. "Beat the edges. Keep it from jumping." Clara swung until her arms shook, the heat turning her face raw. The smoke tore her throat. Somewhere in the haze, she heard the whinny of a terrified horse. And then, through the fire, she saw them. 2 riders on the ridge, their faces hidden under wide brims, watching. She straightened, shovel in hand, and locked eyes with the nearer figure. Even from that distance, she could feel his gaze, cold as a coin. He touched the brim of his hat in a mocking salute and turned his horse. The other followed. The fire was no accident, no warning. It was the first blow, and they'd delivered it while looking her in the eye. By dawn, they had the flames beaten down, but the north fence was a black skeleton against the morning sky. 50 yards of pasture were gone, grass turned to ash. Clara sat on the wagon tongue, her dress damp with sweat and smoke. Cain dropped beside her, breathing hard. "They'll be back," he said. "I know," she said, her voice hoarse. "Next time, we'll be ready." In the barn, the horses stamped nervously. The smell of smoke